Expedition 33 has taken the RPG world by storm recently, but a combination of strong sales figures combined with really strong review scores, this game that seemingly has come out of nowhere has provided for a lot of people what they wanted for over a decade. A game in the style of an older Final Fantasy in an era when Final Fantasy doesn't provide that anymore, in lieu of other styles. This has been a polarized conversation online, but I think it's an important one. Turn-based wasn't dead by any means, but I think its overall reception has been becoming increasingly warmer and more desired. Hello everyone, I am Jmulls, and if you couldn't tell, I absolutely love Clair Obscur Expedition 33. And if we aren't counting remasters and the like, this game is setting itself up to be my game of the year for 2025. And not only that, but one of my favorite games ever in the genre. Everything about it just worked so far in my playthrough, and I'm right near the end of Act 2. One of the most beautiful soundtracks I've heard, combined with some of the most gorgeous set design and imagery I've seen, but paired alongside incredible turn-based gameplay with simple in appearance, deep in execution customization for each party member that you recruit, who all fundamentally play differently to each other. There's a great world map that is fun to explore and find various vendors with costumes or other items or collectibles, or the odd side quest, and I think it's a great way to bring the world map of a SNES and PlayStation era JRPG to the modern day, with modern, non-pixelated or painted environments. Combine all of this with a story that feels like a love letter to so many JRPGs, but unique at the same time, with amazing characters and voiceover performances, and it's just a game that gets every element of being a game right. For a lot of people, this is the exact game they've wanted Square Enix to make for the longest time, and they just simply haven't. Now, I want to be clear on this. I love Final Fantasy, including the modern games. Heck, I love those games so much that a while back I described this current era of Final Fantasy as a golden age. However, it is not perfect, and has its problems. Problems that Expedition 33 seemingly noticed and took notice of. Let me explain. Final Fantasy has an identity problem. Some people, myself included, will point out that gameplay is not necessarily an element that defines what it means to be a Final Fantasy game, especially in the modern era, and I would agree with that sentiment largely for the modern day. It's a series that almost prides itself on doing different things and having games with different genres that match what they're going for, at least for that individual game. Yes, while a lot of modern Final Fantasy games have elected for more real-time combat in lieu of the turn-based and ATB turn-based of old, even within the confines of real-time combat, there is a ton of variance. From the clunky hold the stick in different directions for different combos of Final Fantasy 15 with its unique grenade-based magic system, and teleporting swords to Final Fantasy 7 Remake and Rebirth's blend between real-time combat with ATB commands that slow combat down meant to emulate the feel of the ATB system of old, to Final Fantasy XVI's more hack-and-slash combo-oriented action combat, or even Final Fantasy Origin's more Souls-like twist. These games play differently, and for some people, that's a strength, but I think it's a genuine problem when it comes to brand recognition and for cultivating a wider fan base on the whole. The label that gameplay is not a defining element of what it means to be a Final Fantasy game anymore is the exact problem in my eyes, especially when we're talking about a video game. From a weird over-reliance on exclusivity that clearly didn't pan out since Square has now fully gone multi-platform, combined with a lack of a gameplay identity on top of infrequent mainline releases, it all culminates in the current state of Final Fantasy, where if you like the variants, you probably like a lot of what Final Fantasy still offers, like myself. However, if you are looking for consistency at any level, you probably aren't finding it, especially when the games we do get can be inconsistent in their overall quality. From Final Fantasy XV's pacing and clunky gameplay to 16's side content not particularly being up to par, and also in my opinion the gameplay getting super repetitive midway on, with a story that peaks far too early, or Final Fantasy VII Remake's lack of particularly stimulating side content thanks to it just being Midgar, or Final Fantasy VII Rebirth side content feeling too much sometimes, with some minigames that are just rough to play even if they are not required. I want to be clear. I love all of these games, and Rebirth itself is one of my favorite games Square Enix have ever put out. The point I'm trying to highlight, though, is that these games have noticeable issues, and for games in a series where gameplay will probably be hit or miss for you due to its inconsistency on top of how infrequent these games can be released compared to what Final Fantasy used to be, yeah, we do get that's kind of the deal with modern game design, but that still doesn't rectify any of these problems for consumers, especially when the core audience that Final Fantasy built itself on all those years ago have largely just gone ignored for the longest time. Each entry itself is not necessarily building up a new core audience. Rather, it feels like they are trying to capture a new audience with each new entry. But due to that lack of consistency, the series doesn't retain much of that new audience, because they aren't being catered to in regards to the gameplay that got them interested to begin with. I'm lucky. I started with Final Fantasy 15 and happened to go back to the older games like 6 and 7, and I fell in love with them. But if I'm someone who got hooked because of Final Fantasy 15, there hasn't been another FF game like Final Fantasy 15 since 15 came out. The closest one is Rebirth, which is the second game in another series that increasingly gives off the impression that if you want to fully enjoy it, you need to know so much about FF7 as a sub-series in a larger series. Again, I'm fine with it, because I know a good amount of Final Fantasy 7, and have played the OG FF7 multiple times, and I've played Crisis Core. And I also watched shocking amounts of Maximilian Dood.
The back shots are incredible, Chad.
But that's really intimidating for new players interested in diving into it, especially when the second game can be really confusing for a more casual audience that aren't going to dedicate time to try and untangle all the various webs. I did, and I love it, but most people just want an engaging game that makes sense, and Rebirth leaves off on mystery upon mystery, wrapped in enigmas, abandoned in a forest of question marks. That, while I find that fascinating, and I'm on the edge of my seat to find out more about, we have to wait till like 2027, in all likelihood, for the actual conclusion to all of this. That is a long wait. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy XVI plays and feels like none of the other titles that I've talked about today. And while I again really enjoyed and liked Final Fantasy XVI, Clive is one of my favorite protagonists in series history. Here's the thing. No one knows right now what Final Fantasy XVII is even going to look like mechanically. Will it take the combat from Rebirth, 16, 15, or even go back to turn-based? And if you go back to turn-based, ATB or true turn-based, how can you build hype for a game and its future, all the while cultivating an audience of people when they don't even know what genre it's going to be, and if the game will even be for them? I don't think all of Final Fantasy's woes in this regard would be immediately rectified by going back to turn-based, but bringing Clair Obscur Expedition 33 back into the conversation here, what that game does and shows is that a game that is turn-based, that is in the style of those older Final Fantasy games that so many people fell in love with back in the day, and still to this day, can not only work, but blossom from a small group of passionate developers that banded together who acquire talent from seemingly random places and just make a great game that has great scope, vision, imagination, and execution on every level. Is it a perfect game? No, but it gets right what it needs to get right. Clair Obscur Expedition 33, in many ways, is what so many people, not everyone, but so many people wanted to see from Final Fantasy in the modern day. This is how they viewed each of those older Final Fantasy games when they played them all those years ago, and it's doing so well despite Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion Remastered shadow dropping a few days before it came out, which could have taken some of the spotlight away from this game, but Expedition 33 is such a good game that it stood out despite that. Despite that less than fortuitous situation that it found itself in, it's still shone like a brilliant diamond. I'm not saying Final Fantasy needs to do turn-based. I'm not saying it needs to do real-time combat. What I am saying is that as a brand, I think the smarter play is to build up brand identity and recognition. I think the days where gameplay isn't an identifying element of Final Fantasy should be a thing of the past. the series needs consistency more than anything. And not just consistency when it comes to the release schedule, not just consistency in the scope of each mainline game, but also consistency in the most important element of any game, the gameplay. I think they have developed something truly special with Rebirth's combat. It's a blend between clearly what they want to do with real-time combat, but harkening back to the ATB system of old in a beautiful fusion. That, if you aren't going to go back to turn-based, should be the gameplay identity of not just Final Fantasy VII, but Final Fantasy going into the future. It's strong, malleable, fun, reactive, it feels good, and it's just well designed, while also retaining party-centric and forward gameplay in combat, while also giving grounds for amazing boss fight design and a gameplay flow that is fun, rewarding, and addictive. Clair Obscur Expedition 33 waters an audience that had been left to drown for a mainline Final Fantasy-style turn-based RPG that Final Fantasy cultivated for decades only to let wither on the vine for over a decade. Having said that, let's address one other popular talking point going around right now in response to people talking about and pointing out the connections between older Final Fantasy and Clair Obscur, the other RPG series that Square Enix makes. Dragon Quest, Bravely Default, Octopath, there's quite a few series, and to my knowledge, all if not most of those are turn-based. So why are people making a big deal out of Final Fantasy going in a different direction? Well, while I haven't played all of these games, I have at least dipped my toe in quite a few, and none of them cater to that old Final Fantasy style. Dragon Quest is the closest, but Dragon Quest XI was a game that came out back in 2017. Now for the others. We can say graphics don't matter, and if a game is good enough, a true gamer will look past graphics. And yeah, to some degree, that's right. But for mass market appeal, your game still has to look pretty, and gorgeous to some degree. And going from a series that used to be renowned for how gorgeous they were for the time they came out, to pixel art and chibi art styles, again, I want to emphasize, that's fine. Just don't expect to win over a more casual audience. But also, let's focus in on Bravely Default. The game originally came out on the 3DS. What audience was this game supposed to appeal to? Old school Final Fantasy fans who also happen to own a 3DS? The exclusivity hurts. And when you go for a sequel, well then, you run into the problem of people not having been attached to the series before that point because it was again a 3DS game that is now being brought back for Switch 2, by the way. Octopath is beautiful, and while I wanted to love it, I just bounced off when the game basically starts with 8 separate origin stories, one after the other, so the second I become invested in one character, they were kind of sidelined while I had to go through the gauntlet of all the other ones before continuing that character's story. And while I hear the execution is better in Octopath 2, it just put me off the franchise personally, and I doubt I'm alone on that one. Though I also want to emphasize, it's not like these games only sold 15 copies or anything. However, again, the point I'm trying to make here, these games either have weird exclusivity or don't directly appeal to that old school Final Fantasy approach. Also, Square Enix basically doing the same logo for a lot of these games really doesn't help first impressions, and I think just makes a whole lot of people view these games to be slop, even if they are really good, because the packaging is just not unique or interesting. And when they get announced, people just roll their eyes going, oh look, another quota filler, what is this? Clair Obscur Expedition 33 is a really great game, and it's a game where I simply want to play it more. And it continues to impress me the more I play, and I find myself falling more and more in love with it the further I get. It's full of creativity and passion and completely debunks the notion that a great game in the style of an older Final Fantasy with turn-based combat cannot do well or make waves, or just be a great game in the modern day. Modern Final Fantasy gets a lot right, but whereas Clair Obscur Expedition 33 nails story, characters, gameplay, world design, pacing, dialogue, and visuals, modern Final Fantasy tends to always kind of fumble with a couple of those. They do really well with most of them. There's always an exception, there's always a but. I think Final Fantasy, more so than anything, just needs consistency. I think the fear and the worry that they possibly have had that a game in the style of their older titles cannot work in the modern day is thoroughly debunked with the popularity and the success of Expedition 33 relative to the size of that game's development. And while I don't think Final Fantasy needs to just go back to the older days, I think the biggest thing that it needs right now is identity in the gameplay. It needs consistency. And while each Final Fantasy, even going all the way back, can differ and vary based on the aesthetic, world design, and overall tone and atmosphere, and they can still even vary in terms of gameplay going from one title to the other, there's still a clear and strong identity that when you're feeling those games out, when you're playing those games, it felt like a Final Fantasy game. That is a feeling that is really hard to capture in the modern day for Final Fantasy due to just how different each title is to one another. And it's a feeling that I think they need to recapture. And with that, I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Leave a comment down below with what your favorite Final Fantasy game of all time is, and what do you think Final Fantasy needs to do in the future? Or just what would you like to see out of Final Fantasy going into the future? Whether that be from the gameplay, the story, the tone, the atmosphere, the aesthetic, whatever. I'd love to hear your thoughts and hear your opinions and to hear your perspectives. Stay safe, have a great day, go play some video games, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye everybody, until we meet again.